I live in a small village called Pine Creek in Oregon. It's so tiny it doesn't even have a mayor or a town hall. The village is nestled by Pine Creek, where I work for a company that rents out canoes and kayaks. Business is great in the summer, but it slows down a lot the rest of the year. When fall arrives, we only open on weekends, so I find myself with plenty of free time. I enjoy taking my 2 dogs for hikes along the creek. The area is densely wooded on both sides of the water, and in some places the creek is shallow, especially during the dry fall months. Sometimes, instead of hiking through the woods, we wade through the creek itself. My dogs love that, especially the lab mix, since she's a natural water dog. They like to sniff around and they're pretty quiet, just soaking in the surroundings. One day, while we were wading in the creek, both dogs suddenly started barking and pulling me towards the bank. Normally they're very calm, even when they see a squirrel. Curious, I let them lead me to the shore, which was sandy and rocky like a small beach before the trees began. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed tracks in the sand. I had to look closely to see them clearly. They resembled human footprints, but were much larger, as if made by a giant. My first thought was it might be a prank. Someone could have used fake feet to make the tracks. But why would they do that here, where almost no one comes? Plus, the tracks wouldn't last long in the shifting sand. It seemed like too much effort for such a remote place. And then there were the dogs. They wouldn't react like this to just tracks unless whatever made them had just been there. It had to be nearby. The dogs sniffed the tracks, then the air, and eventually calmed down. I figured whatever it was had left. The next time we were out, a few days later, the dogs freaked out in the same spot. They pulled me to the bank again, and this time I saw more tracks and something else, a pile of animal bones. The bones were stacked in a way that no animal would arrange them, like someone with hands had done it. The bones were mostly clean, but some still had bits of flesh. There were also branches and leaves piled up, almost like a makeshift bed for something big. The area had a strange smell, like a mix of dirty socks and wet dog, with a hint of urine. It didn't seem like a person living there, but rather something else. The dogs calmed down again, so I left, thinking the creature was gone. I returned the next day without the dogs, hoping to see whatever it was. I stood at a distance, watching, but saw nothing for a long time. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a strange noise like someone yelling but without any words. It went on for a while, and I thought maybe the creature saw me and was telling me to go away. Feeling like I was intruding, I left. After that, I decided to stay away. From what I could tell, the creature wasn't harming anyone. It had its home and kept to itself, so I let it be. I continued taking my dogs out, but we stayed on the other side of the creek. As long as we did, the dogs didn't try to go closer. Sometimes, I still heard the yelling noise, maybe when another animal got too close to its home. We don't have bears here, but maybe coyotes or something else bothered it. As the weather got colder, the noise stopped, and I thought the creature had moved on. But one day, as I was passing by its place from the other side of the creek, I heard the yell again. This time, I felt like it was calling out to me. I stopped and saw something emerge from the woods. It looked like a big, hairy figure, maybe a man in a bear suit, but it wasn't quite human or bear. It stood upright and had a face somewhat like a gorilla. From across the creek, it waved a big, paw-like hand at me. I think it was thanking me for leaving it alone. Since then, I've respected its space and haven't told anyone about it, except you. It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to go hiking in the hills near my hometown. The leaves had started to turn golden and red, and the air was filled with the fresh scent of pine and earth. I had always loved exploring the outdoors, and today felt like the perfect day for an adventure. With my backpack loaded with snacks, water, and a flashlight, I set off on the familiar trail. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Birds chirped happily, and squirrels scurried about, gathering acorns for the winter. The trail wound through the forest, leading me deeper into the hills. After about an hour of walking, I came across a narrow, overgrown path that I had never noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see where it led. The path was rough and uneven, with roots and rocks jutting out. I had to be careful with each step, but the sense of adventure spurred me on. The path eventually led to a large, dark opening in the side of a hill. It was a cave, hidden away from the main trail. I paused for a moment, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I had heard stories about this cave, tales of strange creatures and eerie noises, but I had never seen it for myself. Taking a deep breath, I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cave was cool and damp, with the sound of dripping water echoing off the walls. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing jagged rock formations and glittering minerals. I walked slowly, marveling at the beauty of the cave. As I ventured deeper, the cave opened up into a large chamber. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like giant icicles, and the floor was uneven, covered in small pools of water. It was then that I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the far end of the chamber. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear. The rustling grew louder, and I aimed my flashlight in the direction of the noise. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then suddenly, a massive shape moved into the light. I gasped in shock. It was a bat, but not just any bat. This creature was enormous, with wings that must have spanned at least 10 feet. Its eyes glowed red in the light, and its fur was dark and matted. For a moment, I stood there, unable to move. The giant bat flapped its wings, creating a gust of wind that sent ripples through the pools of water on the floor. It let out a high-pitched screech, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had never seen anything like it. This was no ordinary bat. It was a creature straight out of a legend. The bat didn't seem aggressive, but I knew I couldn't stay. Slowly, I began to back away, keeping my flashlight trained on the bat. It watched me with those glowing eyes, but it didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way back to the entrance of the cave. Every step felt like an eternity, but eventually I reached the mouth of the cave and stepped out into the sunlight. I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration. I had just encountered a creature that few people would believe existed. As I made my way back to the main trail, I couldn't help but think about what I had seen. The giant bat was real, and it was living right here in the hills near my hometown. I decided to keep the location of the cave a secret. I didn't want to disturb the bat or bring unwanted attention to it. Instead, I would cherish the memory of my encounter and share the story with those who loved and respected nature as much as I did. As I walked back home, the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The adventure had left me feeling more connected to the natural world than ever before. I knew that the hills held many more secrets, waiting to be discovered by those with a sense of wonder and a love for the wild. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the day in my mind. The image of the giant bat, with its glowing eyes and massive wings, was etched into my memory. It was a reminder that the world was full of mysteries, and that sometimes the most incredible experiences come when we least expect them. The next day, I returned to my usual routine, but the memory of the giant bat stayed with me. Whenever I went hiking, I found myself glancing towards the hidden path, wondering if the bat was still there, hidden in its cave. It became a part of my own personal mythology, a story I would tell around campfires and to close friends who shared my love for the wild. I remember the first time I saw the creature. It was a chilly evening in late September. My name is Clive, and I live with my wife Sarah and our 2 children, Brooke and Justin, in a small house on the outskirts of Hopkinsville. Life was peaceful and quiet until that night. It started with strange noises. At first, we thought it was just the wind, or maybe some wild animals outside, but the sounds were unlike anything we had ever heard. Scratching, tapping, and sometimes even what sounded like soft whispers. One night, as I was reading in the living room, I heard a loud thump coming from the kitchen. I rushed to see what it was and found the back door slightly open. I could have sworn I locked it before. I quickly closed and locked it again. The next morning, Sarah found strange footprints in the garden. They were small, almost like a child's, but with long claw-like toes. She showed them to me, and we both felt a shiver run down our spines. We didn't want to scare the kids, so we kept it to ourselves. A week went by, and the noises continued. One night, Sarah woke me up, trembling. "Clive, I saw it," she whispered. "It was outside our window." I got up and looked out, but there was nothing there. I tried to comfort her, saying it was probably just her imagination, but deep down, I was scared too. The next evening, we heard a loud crash in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and slowly made my way up the creaky stairs. The air was cold and musty. As I reached the top, I shone the light around, but nothing seemed out of place. Suddenly, I heard a soft giggle behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly descended the stairs. We decided it was time to tell the kids. Brooke and Justin listened with wide eyes as we explained what had been happening. Brooke, being the older one, tried to be brave, but Justin was clearly frightened. We all agreed to stick together and keep the doors and windows locked at all times. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The creature, which we started calling the Goblin, seemed to become bolder. It would knock on the windows, scratch at the doors, and sometimes even peek inside. We never got a clear look at it, but its glowing eyes and sharp teeth were enough to give us all sleepless nights. One evening, as we were having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. We heard a faint chuckle, and then the sound of tiny feet running across the roof. Brooke screamed, and I grabbed a flashlight. We huddled together in the living room, trying to stay calm. The power came back on after a few minutes, but the fear lingered. Desperate for help, I called the local police. They came and inspected the house, but found no evidence of an intruder. They suggested it might be a prankster or even our imagination playing tricks on us. But we knew better. The goblin was real. Months went by, and the terror continued. We barely slept, and the stress was taking its toll on all of us. We tried everything to get rid of the goblin. We set traps, sprinkled salt around the house, and even called a local priest to bless our home. Nothing worked. One cold night in December, the goblin seemed more active than ever. It banged on the windows, scratched at the walls, and made eerie noises that echoed through the house. We were all in the living room, clutching each other, when suddenly it stopped. The silence was deafening. We waited, but there was no more noise. Cautiously, I got up and looked around. There was no sign of the goblin. The next morning, we found the footprints again, but this time, they led away from the house and disappeared into the woods. Days turned into weeks, and the goblin never returned. Slowly, we began to relax and regain a sense of normalcy. The kids were able to sleep in their own rooms again, and Sarah and I could finally breathe easier. We never found out what the goblin was or where it went, but we were just grateful that it was gone. Even now, years later, the memory of those terrifying months lingers in the back of my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint echo of its laughter, and I wonder if it's really gone for good. But I try not to dwell on it. We survived, and that's all that matters. The Hopkinsville Goblin remains a mystery, a dark chapter in our family's history. We've moved on, but we'll never forget the fear and the strange creature that terrorized us for those long, cold months. I was listening to old stories on your channel and saw a post about something similar to what happened to me 10 years ago. It was September 2014, and I was working the night shift at the Eugene Police Department in Oregon. I was on patrol alone that night, and it had been quiet until dispatch called and asked me to check an alarm at a local elementary school. The school was on a rural road outside the city, so it took me about 10 minutes to get there. When I arrived, everything looked fine. As I was driving back to town, my police radio started making static noises and then went silent. A few minutes later, I heard a loud buzzing sound behind my car. I thought it might be an electrical transformer. Then, another officer came over the radio, sounding scared. He said he was being followed by a UFO and needed help. I turned around with my lights flashing and drove to his location, north of Eugene, near some farm fields. When I got there, all my car's electronics stopped working, including my radio. I got out and went to the other officer's car. We saw 3 bright red-orange orbs hovering about 50 feet above us. They made no sound and disappeared into thin air within seconds. Our radios started working again, but there was a lot of interference. More backup units arrived, but their radios were also filled with static. We all drove north to Junction City, where everything went back to normal. We called dispatch on our cell phones and found out other officers had the same radio problems that night. The static from the radio filled the silence of my patrol car. The night was dark, and the orbs had just vanished. Officer Matthews and I were trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We were standing outside our cars, looking up at the empty space where the lights had been. The night was still again. It felt like the world had paused. "Did you see that?" Matthews asked, his voice a mix of awe and fear. I nodded, not trusting my voice at that moment. We were cops, trained to deal with reality. But this was something else. More backup units arrived, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They stopped and got out, looking around with confusion and concern. "What's going on?" one of the backup officers, Jenkins, asked. "Dispatch said you guys lost comms?" Before we could answer, the static on our radios died down, and a voice cut through, clear as day. It wasn't dispatch. It was calm. Too calm. "Officers, remain calm. You are safe. Do not fear." The voice was almost robotic. I looked at Matthews, who was staring at his radio, pale in the moonlight. "Who is this? Identify yourself," Jenkins demanded into his radio, but there was no response, just the return of the static. We stood there, in the middle of the rural road, looking at each other. The night had gone quiet again. "We need to document this," I said, my voice sounding strange. "Everything we saw, everything we heard. They'll think we're crazy, but we have to report it." Matthews nodded, and we got to work, writing down everything while it was still fresh. The other officers did the same. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking up at the sky, half expecting to see those orbs again. But there was nothing, just the stars and the dark. After we'd written down everything, we headed back to the station. The cars started without issue, and the radios were back to normal. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. What did it mean? Why us? Would anyone believe us? I had no answers, just a deep sense of unease. Back at the station, we filed our reports. Dispatch took our statements, promising to pass them up the chain. I never found out what those orbs were. There was talk of government tests, drones, and other explanations, but none fit what we'd seen. I continued working the night shift, patrolling the same roads. But every time I passed that stretch of Highway 99, I looked up, searching for something I couldn't explain. That night stayed with me, a reminder of the unknown. I'd been a cop for years, seen many things. But that night was different. It was a mystery wrapped in the night sky, a question without an answer. I left the force a few years later, but the story of that night never left me. It became a part of who I was, a memory to think about during quiet moments. And every September, when the air turns cool and the leaves change, I think back to that night and remember every detail. When I moved into my new condo, I felt so happy. It was a cozy little place on the 3rd floor with big windows that let in lots of sunlight. The first few days were peaceful as I unpacked and arranged my furniture. Everything seemed perfect. One evening, I was sitting on my couch, reading a book, when I heard a soft sound. It was like a whisper, but very faint. I thought it was just the wind, so I ignored it and kept reading. But then, the whisper came again, a little louder this time. It sounded like someone was saying my name, Katie. I looked around, but I was alone. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went to bed early. That night, I had a strange dream. I saw a woman standing in my living room. She looked sad and lonely. Her eyes seemed to be pleading for help. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The next day, I tried to forget about the dream. But when I came home from work, I found a photo frame on the floor. It had fallen from the shelf, even though there was no wind, and I had left the windows closed. I picked it up and put it back, feeling a bit nervous. That night, the whispers came again. This time, they were clearer. I could hear the woman saying, "Help me." I gathered my courage and spoke out loud, "Who are you? What do you want?" To my surprise, the room grew colder, and I saw a faint figure appear. It was the woman from my dream. She looked at me with sad eyes and said, "I lived here a long time ago. I lost something precious and couldn't leave." I felt sorry for her. "What did you lose?" I asked. She pointed to the corner of the room. I walked over and found a loose floorboard. When I pried it open, I discovered an old locket. Inside was a tiny photo of the woman and a little girl. Tears filled my eyes as I realized this was her daughter. The ghostly figure smiled at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Slowly she faded away, and the room felt warmer again. From that day on, I never heard the whispers again. I kept the locket as a reminder of the kind spirit who once lived there. My condo felt even more like home, knowing I had helped someone find peace.